Another week of the WRRC Fall Seminar Series. And today we have Melissa Kunz, who's going to be talking about drought needs finding in Hawaii. Melissa was born and raised on Hawaii Island and worked in urban water conservation in California and Colorado before returning home. She says Hawaii is the best. After focusing on wildfire and drought issues in Hawaii, she now works for the University of Hawaii Ecosystems Extension Program in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management. Melissa's goal is to support the people doing ecological conservation and restoration work by facilitating the flow and exchange of knowledge between all kinds of knowledge holders. So with that, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Okay, yeah, so I just want to start with some thank yous to the Ha'oli Maloa Foundation for supporting my master's work, my master's advisors, Dr. Kirsten Olson, who's here. Thank you, Kirsten, Curtin Litton, and Dr. Victoria Keener. The Pacific Drought Knowledge Exchange and the whole core team there, as well as the interview and survey participants. And I want to thank the folks who've been in conversation with me, the Hawaii Forest Restoration Synthesis Group, and Dr. Clay Charnick and Dr. Leah Bremer, who've helped me kind of digest a lot of the ideas I'll be sharing today. So we'll see how long this takes. Here's a presentation map. I want to start with some terms that I'll be using. Talk about the Pacific Drought Knowledge Exchange Needs Assessment, or PDKE Needs Assessment. The interviews and surveys that I did for that to be a part of that. Talk about their purpose, the methods, the results, and some reflections that I've had since doing all of that. Really quick recap of where things are in filling those needs, or some of them, and then some ideas to explore or implement, or I say steal. I'd be interested what other people think of them, how they take ownership of them and run with them. Okay, so starting with some terms. Types of knowledge. There are different models of knowledge, and one that I've been thinking about lately is explicit versus tacit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is very much in line with our Western worldview, with an academic worldview, and it's about what can be written or shared easily. So something that's spoken, standard operating procedures guide, an organization's annual report, maybe a thesis, a conference poster, a PowerPoint presentation are all forms of explicit knowledge. And I've lately been thinking more about tacit knowledge, or the knowledge that exists in the minds and bodies of people in practice. So they can include things like, the subtle way you know how to interact with your colleagues or supervisors effectively, the best foot placement as you make your way to a field site, how to pack your bag of field equipment most efficiently so that when you get there, you can pull it out without any trouble, what it feels like to use your hands to set it up. And I associate words with this like institutional knowledge, experience, organizational culture, kilo, gut or na'au, all this less verbalized kinds of ways of knowing. And everyone has both kinds of knowledge. We switch back and forth between them. They transform. We take in explicit knowledge, digest it. It might become integrated with our tacit knowledge. We're able to share it as explicit knowledge again. So that's something I've been thinking about that I think applies to a lot of the ideas I'm sharing today. Then talk about needs finding and needs assessment. I kind of smushed two definitions or two terms into one general definition of a process or approach of finding and addressing needs. And you can do this through interviews, surveys, workshops, or observing people. And sometimes you get at needs that are unknown before, maybe they're tacit needs or unspoken, or maybe they're unacknowledged needs. Okay, let's talk about knowledge exchange. I have to refer to a written definition here. Processes that generate, share, and or use knowledge through various methods appropriate to the context, the purpose, and the people involved. It includes things like sharing, reciprocity, generation, co-production. And in this sense, it also tends to refer to having researchers involved in research users, and connecting those different kinds of expertise and experience. And it's often pursued with this idea of we're going to generate better research questions and better research outputs by this knowledge exchange process. And what I like about it is that it acknowledges and values many kinds of experts and many kinds of knowledge. It emphasizes mutual benefit and mutual learning. And I think it also implies greater societal benefits, like let's direct our resources to where they're going to be really valuable for a lot of people. Okay, so given that I like knowledge exchange, when I heard about the Pacific Drought Knowledge Exchange, just as I was starting my master's program, I was excited. I'm like, great, they were just starting their pilot in 2018, 2019. And folks here and online may already be familiar with it through hearing from Ryan Logman, Abby Fraser, and Derek Ford. So in simple terms, the goal of the PDAKE was to make climate and drought information of greater service to land and natural resource managers and stewards. So great, the pilot's going and I'm just hearing about it. What are their goals? Easier access to drought and climate information and data sources, better and more comprehensive information, and improved technical assistance and more collaborative environment for information sharing and information transfer. And part of the pilot plan was to assess what managers did in the last major droughts and collect and synthesize their lessons learned that could be useful for other people. And the idea was to do this through a survey. And I'm like, great, for my capstone, I can do a survey. In the process of designing it and thinking about it, I thought, well, a survey would be conducive to asking about the information sources people use, and we can get a little bit more about what they really need. But a survey wouldn't be very good for getting those detailed on-the-ground observations that are missing from the explicit drought knowledge. So I pivoted to do interviews. So I'm going to share about those interviews. So again, we're keeping the goals of seeing what managers do during drought and gathering their lessons learned. And I wanted to add in, we're going to document their observations, identify what information sources they use, and what kinds of things they need. And I did these interviews over Zoom because COVID, and I asked them things like, what drought effects did you notice or have you observed and experienced, and what would help you do your job better when it comes to drought? And they gave me a lot of knowledge. It went from being tacit, embodied in their heads, to explicit, so it could be documented. But you know, it's limited. Most of the interviews were around an hour, no more than an hour and a half. And so I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of knowledge that remains held within people's heads that we're never going to get out. But so this is just a start, and getting more to that embodied tacit knowledge requires longer relationships and longer interactions. Okay, and so who did I talk to? I wanted to talk to folks across the state in different land management kinds of agencies. So here's a breakdown. I talked to people who worked for the state of Hawaii, who worked for watershed partnerships, federal agencies, and also a few folks on private land holdings. And I was targeting folks who made drought observations, did anything related to drought planning, or implementing drought response actions. So chat with them on Zoom, record the conversations, transcribe them, and then look at those transcripts. I did this through qualitative analysis, categorizing all that transcript content into major themes. So there they all are, all at once. Climate and weather, ecosystem health and function, threats and pressures, manager activities, their lessons learned, information sources and uses, and their needs and questions. So I took all these to look at, okay, what occurs most frequently? What are the details within those themes? And what relationships do these themes have to each other? And of course, most prominent in the natural resource manager's mind when it comes to drought is wildfire. My number one concern is fire, as someone said. And I've said before, I don't spend a lot of time here because Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization and Pacific Fire Exchange already do a lot to describe the impacts, both social and ecological, and are working to address those impacts and preparation for wildfire. So, but it's good to know that fire has long-term landscape scale negative impacts for native ecosystems. Okay, moving on from fire. The second most important theme for managers, their challenge, was around restoration, particularly with like survival of outplants and dealing with landscape scale resources. As someone said, we spend a lot of time picking seeds, germinating them, growing them, potting them in the nursery, and finally we get to plant them. We have to do weed control, we water them, and then we have droughts and they die. And since first doing this, I realized that, you know, a lot of times we see just the outplanting part, and I started reflecting on, but then there's the grant writing and the staff hiring and the staff training, all the rearing in the nursery, like what goes into that, transporting the plants up there, getting the volunteers together to stick them in the ground. So I have a greater appreciation for when they say like all their hard work just might go up in smoke or dust. So the plants are suffering from a lack of water. They're more susceptible to pests and disease, to heat and wind dries them out even more susceptible to fog and acid rain. And it changes the fruiting patterns of especially rare plants. It's concerning, harder to collect seeds. The seeds that do fall may not germinate. But then what do folks do? Oh, and it's hard because it happens on a landscape scale instead of just a small little area. Someone said you can't water a forest. So what do managers do? What are some of the adaptations or adjustments they've made? One was using shorter plant dibbles so that they have better quality holes when they're planting plants and so that their roots can find their own way. Two is they don't take out all the things that might be shading out plants. They might keep some taller non-native plants to provide some moisture retention for outplantings. And supplemental watering is a common strategy. What comes after that? Okay, but with all this, they still want to know, like, even when it's not drought, are all our conservation and restoration actions really making a difference? Like a lot of watershed partnership folks, their stated purpose is to improve watershed function and groundwater recharge, but you know, they don't know. And when it comes to drought, it's like, is all our effort worth it? Okay, other needs that they talked about was a greater understanding of how pests and disease interact with drought on plants and ecosystems of interest. They want to know, okay, if we are going to supplemental water, what's the bare minimum we can do to keep the plants alive and healthy and get them through this drought? And kind of a bigger question that relates more to climate and not so much short-term drought is, where should we be planting and protecting things? Given the specifics of this landscape that I'm responsible for, where does it make sense into the future for me to spend my attention and energy? Okay, moving on to non-native mammals. One person said, when it gets really dry, feral animals, goats, sheep, pig, deer, cattle, they have a profound effect on the areas they're in. They put additional pressure on ag operations, livestock, vegetable farming, as well as native forests and watersheds. So what do? Well, they bark strip trees, injuring the trees and plants. They put pressure on fences, so you might need more fence maintenance and fence repair. They move from their usual spots and congregate to where there's limited water and food left. And at the time I first gave this talk, it was only recently that on Molokai, there was this big axis deer die-off. And so there's a public health thing. They had to like literally scoop the deer with like backhoes or something into big pits to take care of them because the deer were suffering too. Okay, and then I thought it was also interesting to hear people talk about rodents. And during drought, they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they'll gnaw on rare plants. They'll eat more of the fruits and seeds. They'll gnaw on irrigation lines that are meant to water outplantings. And then after the drought, when their own predators are kind of low in number, they're able to feed on the grass seed and stuff that comes up. So their population booms and people get overrun with mice. Also, since the first time I gave this presentation and now, there was like this big mouse plague or rat plague in Australia. I don't know if anyone remembers that. It made headlines. So anyway, and that's because it was after a drought that the rodent populations boomed. So some ideas around this are to be more mindful of and increase the rodent control around rare plants or snails, and to be prepared when you're coming out of drought for a rodent population boom. Okay, this is my favorite part to talk about, and that's how drought affects the people in conservation operations. Someone said humans are part of the ecosystem. So one thing that people change in drought is that they'll shift what invasive weeds they go after, because herbicide is not as effective on plants that are not growing, like the grasses, and they'll switch to trying to control woody species instead. They notice that there's more erosion on the trails. It's dry and dusty, so it might require different kind of trail maintenance or safety precautions. Because of the dust, helicopters might not be able to land where they normally do. But when it's clearer skies consistently, it means that helicopter resources are able to be used more consistently without delays. Other things that folks do are they check up on their water infrastructure. One person said, you know, when it's dry, it's a good time to make sure your water infrastructure is in good working order. It's a good time to monitor rare plants a little more closely. But then, okay, so that's the external stuff that they're doing. But what about closer into that person? It's hotter, drier. People might sweat more, they'll get more fatigued in the heat and dehydrated. To prevent fire ignitions, because it's more of a concern during a drought, they might limit their access or activities. For example, you don't weld fence when it's dry out. And also because of that wildfire risk and the risk of losing outplantings that they work so hard to put in, there's a lot of anxiety or maybe let's say discomfort tied up in drought. And also folks talked about how it's kind of sad when you see that happening, when the landscape you care about seems to be suffering, when the plants that you have nurtured and protected are suffering or even go extinct. Some folks talked about attributing, you know, I think what really did it might have been the long-term drying effects of this area. So it does have an effect on the people in conservation. And that's why I like thinking about this slide. Okay, from the interviews, what do we know about the information uses and needs of a manager? They use like drought and climate information for planning. They use it to justify requests for funding. And they also use it to communicate with others about the resources they're protecting and what they're doing in them. What do they need? I don't like using a crystal ball because I don't think that's really a good representation of what climatologists actually do. Tom can correct me, but okay. But you know, everyone wants better drought prediction, and the managers love maps. They want them high resolution, and they talk about we need more weather stations in these remote areas. And then something I thought was very interesting that came up was it's not just that the information is needed, but interpretation help is needed too, especially when it comes to uncertainty and trying to figure out what does this map mean for my particular area? What do these projections mean for my particular area? How am I supposed to make sense of this probability? And also interesting was people talking about the need to talk to their peers about the information too, so they could get a drought data product, but then one of the things they'd want to do with it is go to someone else and see what they were using it for and how they interpreted and used it. And I don't think that's necessarily captured in the knowledge exchange idea we originally talked about. So it's more like that peer connection. Okay, outputs from this project. I wrote a capstone paper, and in the appendices were like a list of needs and lessons learned that I hope people can refer to, but I don't know how much they will. I think it might feed into the PDKE drought needs assessment. And also created these fact sheets, basically sharing what I just shared with you about those different aspects of the drought experience in land stewardship. I'll take a sip of water. Since making these fact sheets, I've reflected a little bit, and I think maybe they were kind of sort of selfish. I started working on them because I was stuck in my writing and analysis process, and I needed a way to get unstuck. So it was a creative thing to do. And it turned out, oh, like it could be a product. So this was helping me, and we can turn it into a product. And I'm grateful to the folks at the Drought Knowledge Exchange who decided it was worth doing. But I want to talk about some of my fails with this. I didn't have a specific audience in mind, except for maybe the managers I spoke to. I wanted to honor the experiences and knowledge they shared. But other than that, I didn't really know. I didn't have anyone specific in mind. I wasn't sure if it was going to be helpful to anybody in any particular way. I had no plan to disseminate it, except maybe through the Pacific Drought Knowledge Exchange website, which had yet to be created. And I honestly have yet to ask for feedback on these fact sheets and see what they did, if anything, for anybody. So, and part of that feedback thing is like, I'm not sure who to ask for feedback. So I wanted to share that because I think fact sheets are my default, and it may be a lot of people's defaults. And I just want myself, maybe helpful for other people to think about these things more explicitly. Okay, so let's talk about this survey next. Why are we doing a survey again? Because it was in the proposal. And also, I'm glad we did it because we got more information out of it. And what was, I guess, one takeaway from the slide is that surveys don't have to be completely original to hopefully be effective. So things that fed into it was the Joint Fire Science Program and Pacific Fire Exchange Survey, which informed the Southwest Drought Learning Network Survey, and a few other questions that I developed after the interviews. So this survey was kind of an amalgamation of questions from these prior and related efforts. The intent was to have a broader participant pool than my interviews did, to ask about specific information sources, to assess how accessible and relevant drought information products currently are, and to ask about peer-to-peer learning. So how did it go? Well, we sent out 181 invitations, 67 people completed them, 52 people, an additional 52 people answered at least some of the questions and were helpful there. But if you just take the complete, it's about a 39% completion rate, assuming no one forwarded on the survey invitation. So what did those respondents look like? Their primary affiliations are here. A quarter of them were from state agencies, roughly a quarter from federal agencies, and the rest nonprofits, private landowners, university, and then little slices of pie there. But we asked also in what context do you deal with drought or water shortage? And I realized the text is rather small, but I think the main thing you need to know is that the top or most, and people could select multiple things. The top response was conservation and restoration, followed by fire, followed by cultural land stewardship, aloha aina, and forestry. And then where you would hope to have more respondents, water supply and quality, agriculture, rain-fed and irrigated, and like that. So again, reflecting afterwards, I was hoping for more folks from agriculture or water supply. And I realized that this was a bias introduced by the network I developed through doing the interviews. So the people I interviewed, I had at least developed a budding relationship with them. I requested that they share the survey with their network, even if they didn't fill it out themselves. And I didn't have the same kind of connections to the water supply or agriculture community. And we did have contacts that we sent them out to, but my suspicion is because those folks weren't as familiar with who I was, what I was doing, that they were less inclined to respond. So the rest of the results come with the big caveat that this is tending towards folks who almost all were in natural resources management. Okay, common themes with the interviews. People rely a lot on the National Weather Service and their peers. Also, survey respondents want better drought prediction. They also want information specific to their landscapes. And they're also concerned about wildfire and restoration failures due to drought. So now I'm going to talk about what was mostly in the survey, but not in the interviews. But these were the things that they had in common. Okay, so we see the restoration theme comes back in challenges and lessons learned, but yay, I'm going to highlight what we did get from water supply and agriculture. So in restoration, things we didn't hear before. Soils get hydrophobic. That's not good. Wetland habitat diminishes. And people want to know, what else am I supposed to do besides water more? Like, can you give me something a little more, a little different than that? And I don't know what those things would be. Okay, in agriculture, people supplemental feeding and watering for their livestock. They noticed that their honey production was down, and kalo was more susceptible to disease, and also in-stream flows for kalo patches went down. So that's a sad kalo over there. In water supply, there was a very specific comment about maintaining in-stream flow standards while also maintaining water quality. From a municipal standpoint, maintaining enough volume and pressure in the system for firefighting purposes, and having to seek out groundwater sources to supplement surface water sources. Other things people mentioned were I had trouble getting drought relief funding, and also the general public seems unaware and doesn't care. Okay, so what were things that helped them with these challenges? In restoration, people took monitoring photo points. They noticed that their more robust outplanting seedlings did better. In agriculture, they had to destock and pay attention to the conditions and reduce their herds. And for what was left, they also again did supplemental watering. On the water supply side, one person talked about paying Board of Water Supply to fill their water tank. And somebody also talked about just having to balance and manage and figure out the surface water supplies distribution. And other things that people mentioned, public service announcements about the drought, some pertaining to, look, drought's not just about fire public safety impacts, but also impacts to our landscapes. And one person talked about, just knowing we were in the drought helped me. And I'm going to assign that to like that embodied tacit knowledge. It's like, this is helping me make sense of the world as it is right now. Okay, some results I was interested in also were that 50% of respondents said that they use cultural or indigenous knowledge in some way. And it's been pointed out to me that, again, we're in the natural resources heavy audience, so it may be more likely that that group would be mindful of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous local knowledge. Some of the things people said about this and how they applied it was named weather phenomena, having a familial relationship with ecosystem elements, applying traditional planting techniques. Folks also talked about this holistic systems thinking approach and using kilo or observation as part of understanding drought phenomena. Okay, now we're going to dive into some needs and gaps revealed by the survey. A lot of these overlap. So information and tools for best practices. Like, what should we do as it relates to drought? Again, drought prediction and notification. They want information on climate change, variability, and drought for their place. They want more information on drought impacts, resources on how to plan, or that there's a need for drought planning. One person said, when it's not drought, it's not important. When it is drought, it's too late. And I'm going to circle back to that. Folks say there needs to be more public awareness and action, more energy put towards traditional, cultural, indigenous knowledge. They want more data and more communication and coordination. So I think I might skip okay. Some specific quotes about needs and gaps. Water supply, very specific, sustainable well water yields. One I thought was very interesting was urban growth in drought-prone areas and needing to address that. People wanted transparency and how water restrictions are enforced. They want to know what the future holds, Tom. And kind of communication, public expectation setting, and again, talking about traditional and cultural knowledge. I want to go back to that thing about planning. I asked one question, and I wish I'd asked more about, does your organization have a written drought plan or plan that includes drought? And most people, well, the biggest chunk said no or not sure. And I was really I was like, I didn't know what I expected with this. And I only asked that one question. And I wish I had asked more. What are the reasons people say they do or do not have a drought plan? At what level of the organization is there a drought plan? Maybe it's just a matter of where you are in the organization and your level of awareness with what's going on. And what are the conditions or motivations under which people develop drought plans? So these are all unanswered questions about drought planning, but given the identified need for drought planning resources, I think it's something to pay attention to. Okay, now I was excited about the survey in part because we can track how effective is the PDKE over time in terms of making information more accessible, relevant, useful to managers. So at the bottom here, we have, okay, how convenient is it to find? How easy it is to use this information? How easy is it to find an expert? And how easy is it to apply this information or research? So now I'm going to give you not the most fun graph, except for the colors. And so on the left side is that it's very difficult and moderately difficult, neutral, moderately easy, very easy. And then the last set of columns there is, I haven't tried to do this yet, so we can kind of ignore that rightmost column. But I like this because we can do this survey again and see how this changes over time. And I want to point out a couple of things. One is that people actually find it, so looking at that tall green bar, people find it relative to other things to do, easy to find expertise around drought and climate, easy to find a person is my guess, but they find it's harder to use information. And to find information, it's kind of a wash for how convenient it is to find drought information. But to me, this speaks to the importance of relationships and finding information and gaining knowledge. There was more I wanted to say about this. Yeah, but I think this is interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how these metrics change over time. I remember now. Okay, it goes back to interpretation. Maybe if you can even find information, which it might be difficult to do, it'd still be good to find that person too, who might have handed it off to you. Okay, but talking to Ryan, I asked Ryan, so he made these beautiful climate portfolios for folks, and I asked him how it went, and he said he was only able to really dig into it with one person, in part because of capacity. There's one Brian, and he wants to train up more folks to be able to help managers interpret and get more granular and site-specific, but that's limited. So I think that's part of where peer-to-peer learning comes in. And the survey asked about how people wanted to do that. They want good inclusion. They want time for people to interact and share and build continuity. And they want folks to share failures. What didn't work? Why did it go wrong? And then when we ask people, I'm sorry for this awful table, we ask people like, okay, how do you want to learn from your peers? Forum and symposium was the most mentioned, followed by a data portal, then social network, presentations, but sort of lower on the list was like talk story, you know? which is interesting. So we asked another question. Okay, if you have lessons learned, experiences you want to share about drought, how do you want to do that? And of course, the most popular one was to talk story, just informal. And the least popular was to give a presentation to an audience. And I think that's something to remember, that the way we want to receive information, it might be different from how people want to share it. So again, here's giving a presentation, and there's the informal talk story. Okay, so zooming back out to needs and gaps again. Here they were. How are they being filled? And I formatted this conveniently. So the ones that I know of are being filled or in progress are towards the bottom. So with understanding and higher resolution, the climate change, variability, and drought, we have the Water Resources Center and the Hawaii Climate Data Portal making big strides in that way. Same with the data aspect. Looking at traditional, cultural, local, indigenous knowledge, folks are having an understanding and actual practice of how to do this, getting that tacit knowledge. And Dr. Katie Kamelamela did a project on looking at descriptions of drought in Nupepa and interviewing folks. And yeah, I should follow up with her on that. But she's, again, bringing kind of that less visible into the more visible for how we can do that. Drought impacts, part of it covered by this project, and communication and coordination is, starting to be filled by the Pacific Drought Knowledge Exchange. Okay, we're towards the end. I didn't know how long this would take, so thanks for sticking with me. These are, you can steal these ideas. I know in academia, stealing is not good, so just, take it and run with it and give it credit where you want to. And so these ideas are related to pulls versus pushes of knowledge and information and needs finding and lines of work. So I'll talk about the first one. And here's a recent example. I was in a drought monitor meeting, and Kevin Kodama was on the line, and he serves as like the drought observer that feeds information back to the national US drought monitor. And he gets information pushed to him by observers. So they are proactively sending him information. And my understanding is that if there are gaps that he sees, he might reach out to individuals for their observations. But there are a whole bunch of untapped observers. And I would say that our land managers, I don't know if they're sending stuff into Kevin. There's this whole body of people who are making observations and care about this stuff on the landscape. But understandably, Kevin doesn't have time to proactively go out and request all these. His probably inbox is really nuts. So as it is. So what do we do about these untapped observers, especially when we want more ecological drought knowledge or drought observations? Well, one suggestion is the PDKE could pull information to proactively ping people, send invitations, which, not everyone will have something to share back, but some more might. That could then be shared with the National Weather Service and even be entered into a particular part of the Drought Monitor website. So I've been thinking about this, like the push versus pull. Do we expect, like, what is the silent, unvoiced expectation we have of people coming to us with their needs versus being proactive about seeking out who might have needs? So a little adjustment to the diagram. Let's say they're managers or land stewards, and we're a researcher, needs filler, or collaborator. And I don't really have any advice for this. It's just like thinking about this of like, what are the pushes of information versus the pulls that I could be engaging in? I think this requires being curious, it requires being proactive, and a third P, push, pull, and presence, because there's some things that aren't going to be gotten over the phone. They're only conveyed by being in person. Okay, second idea to steal, lines of work. And this comes from the Joint Fire Science Program. JFSP is a body that funds fire science research. And they noticed that, hey, we're funding all these great high quality research projects, check, 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 great. But they're all kind of disparate, or not disparate, but like different. They have like different focuses, they're going in different directions. And because of that, we don't have like, they're not really being made use of. There's not a cohesive plan for them. And, you know, it's a little scattered. So they decided, okay, we're going to have a line of work where it's a focused line of inquiry. There are multiple research projects dedicated over 3 or 5 or more years to answer this body of questions around a particular topic. And the example I remember is smoke science. I had no idea smoke science was a thing. It's like, we want to know everything about smoke in wildfires. Like, we want to know how smoke interacts with atmospheric conditions. We want to know what conditions create what kind of smoke. We want to know the health effects of smoke on fire suppression personnel. And by doing this, they could still get high quality research, but it was more holistic and comprehensive, and they could focus their outreach around it and get their message out too. So I'm curious about like what things people think could be done here in terms of a line of work. What's sort of like, what things have maybe 1 or 2 studies on that people really want to know more about, but we only have 1 or 2 studies on, and there's not a concerted effort towards answering a body of questions. One thing that comes to mind is that manager question: are we making a difference in watershed function? I know of a few studies, but they're specific to place. Maybe there needs to be a body of work geared towards that line of inquiry. It could also be like, we want a whole palette of plants and diseases and what to do in drought with them is another example. So something to mull over. And I don't know if like the WRRC is doing this. PICAST might be kind of in this vein. Something I've been mulling over. Maybe you can tell me if I'm okay. Wrapping up. As I'm thinking about this, I think about needs finding and knowledge exchange as complementary processes. I think that they should be ongoing, that needs finding is not a one and done, and that it's part of knowledge exchange, it's built into knowledge exchange. It should be that sustained interaction, sustained relationships, and that exchange of explicit and tacit knowledge ongoing. Drought, there's lots we know, internally, externally, and lots we don't, and progress is being made. And there's some ideas to steal or to mull over, pushes and pulls of needs and information and lines of work. So thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll take questions and also feedback. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Thanks so much. So I'd like to open up the floor to the live audience first.
Well, first of all, this is amazing. You've developed the work so much, and I'm sure it is really. You mentioned about decision making under uncertainty. Do you have any thoughts on, aside from information and sitting with an expert helping interpret that information, were there specific tools that people, decision support tools that would help them make decisions at a scale useful to them?
Yeah. It didn't come up specifically in the surveys or interviews, but also part of the PDKE process was this weeks long, like over the course of several weeks, kind of workshop class through NIACS. I don't know what the acronym is for, but it used the resist, accept, direct framework and gave people a menu of options. So they were directed to think about a relatively small portion of land that they're managing and walk them through steps. So that is a resource that's available to folks. Yeah, but I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Yeah.
But again, I think it, like, people showed up to that workshop because they signed up for it. And my experience of it is it would take a very motivated individual to walk through that process by themselves.
At the end, where you ended with needs finding and knowledge exchange group and connections there, I think we kind of put that under stakeholder engagement, but it's no, at least my own thoughts have never been quite as well thought through as yours. And yeah, I would love to talk to you more about how we can do a better job of, engaging stakeholders, as we say. There are a couple other aspects you talked about. If you need to find a way to connect to Kevin Kodama, you might talk to his daughter, Carrie, to get that push and pull better connected there. Another one, though, earlier in your talk, you were mentioning that watershed partnership folks doing their work were disappointed. It sounded like you were implying that drought occurrence was implied to them that their work wasn't having an effect. So did I interpret that right?
No, I wouldn't say disappointment. I think they just want to know that what they're doing is making a difference. And they, I know that this maybe only applies to specific areas in Hawaii of like the rain follows the forest, but that's a very widespread framework that people are using. And so they want to know, like, us taking care of the forest, is that keeping it moister here? And is our taking care of the forest leading to more groundwater recharge? Because as a watershed partnership, that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Well, if they're waiting for their restoration work to increase rainfall, they're going to be disappointed, because that's just not going to happen in Hawaii. On the, that effect on the scales we have here just is not going to be big enough to be noticed. But it does have effect on moisture. It could have effects on moisture. And so to say the work that they do keeps it moister, that's a different question from saying that there's more rainfall. Yeah. So there could be more cloud water interception. There could be changes in water retention, changes in evapotranspiration. Sometimes it goes the other way, actually, with evapotranspiration. But yeah, I think there is maybe among the people who really count in this work, there's a lot of misunderstanding of how the work they do affects water process.
Yes, I agree. I think they're like, I don't have the full picture either, I'll say. But I think that there does need, like, maybe it's a dissemination thing of there is misunderstanding. And I think that, the rain follows the forest is an easy way to encapsulate that idea. And it's easy to transfer and propagate. But I think it does lead to frustration if people don't confirm that. And it would be helpful for folks to understand why that's the case. Yeah. Yeah.
So besides the crystal ball, I wanted to mention we also use a Ouija board.
Oh, thank you.
Not just using one tool.
That's what's in the server rooms is Ouija boards.
We had a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, so the first one is, what's your sense of how concerned land managers and stewards are about drought? Are they like, it comes and goes, it creates problems, but would you handle them? Or the future is very scary, or something else?
I think it depends on their geography. Honestly, when talking to folks, land managers on Oahu, it was hard to get them to think outside of seasonal, like dry season a little bit. And folks on the leeward sides of Maui and Hawaii Island, or who had seen that or had experienced, I think it depends on geography. Some people are like, drought's not really a concern. I think more about the dry season. For some folks, it really, but then, sorry, I'm not, I think people are thinking about climate change though, and like what kinds of conditions there will be with climate change, and that applies more broadly and is less geographically specific. And I don't know if I can characterize the degree of the fear or anxiety people have around that.
Same person also compliments your slides. Oh. So another question is, what are your thoughts on using data science approaches to mine social media posts for how people are talking about weather, climate, and drought? For example, scraping Instagram, Facebook, or using natural language processing.
Oh, Aurora, that's a really interesting question. I have no experience with this. So that would be actually useful. That could be useful, especially for getting at the detailed drought observations, especially if they have photos included in those posts. So yeah, I think that's a great idea.
There was a excuse me, a comment / question. I concur that this question is a big need of managers that could become a body of work, i.e., is all of the conservation restoration work being done building resilience for Hawaii's ecosystems, especially in the face of climate change. This came out in the 2021 Pacific RISCC manager surveys and being important, and in my conversations with managers.
Thank you, Elliot. Appreciate your being here. And also, I should have added you into the mahalos because I think thinking about the resist, accept, direct framework fed into this, and we've had conversations around that too. Any comments, feedback?
It looks like that might be. Oh, Aurora says, read social media as an information source. I also think it could be informative to see effectiveness of material as you put out.
Thanks, Aurora. I guess I'd have to get on social media. I don't want to do. I don't want to do.
Since there was a call for feedback, maybe it would be good to put in the chat my contact information, or if you want to put your contact information, so that people can follow up. If you want to get in touch later to talk more about the results of this project. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Melissa, for